July is here and almost over, which means it is far past time for my annual mid-year book Freakout, the video where I nominate books to arbitrary categories like Best Character or Most Disappointing. But if you're new here, my name is Jennifer from Walk-Ins Through Life, and I am on a challenge this year to follow 52 book prompts and countless other life prompts throughout the year. Just a preface, if you haven't watched any of my videos before, I am going to be talking through a lot of different books and titles, but I am not going to spoil or summarize any of them for you. If you've already read the book, then hopefully this will feel more like a discussion than a lecture. And if you haven't read the book yet and it sounds interesting, I think that finding it and getting into it is half the journey. And I don't want to steal that from you. So without further ado, the first category I'm going to talk about is the new release that I want to read but haven't yet. As I'm currently filming this, I'm reading 1001 Nights, the Penguin Classic Edition, and John Green's Anthropocene reviewed. I know, we're still reading it. My husband and I are taking our time and enjoying it little by little. But we did just receive Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. And if you don't know, that's his third book in the Secret Project series. And it's beautiful, and as always, I'm excited to read them. So it is a new release. I haven't read it yet, so I think that chalks up perfectly for this category. Category number 2, best book that I've read so far in 2023, absolutely still has to go to The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, although Tress of the Emerald Sea came wildly close to dethroning it. The Illustrated Man was just so cohesively varied, with just so many things to set your mind spinning or light ideas for creative projects. It was just an absolute knockout of a book. The third category is the best sequel that I've read so far this year. And it isn't as hard as it usually is for me, as I've only read 2 sequels this year, and one of them was a flop. Looking at you, Fork the Witch and the Worm, which leaves me with How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, which I'm fine with because I did enjoy this. And it was a fun sequel. It was more of a short story novella kind of a thing, very quick read. But it gave us a fun insight into a character that I wanted to know more about. Next is the most anticipated release, and I'm not gonna lie, I am terrible at knowing what's coming out and what's coming next, what authors are working on. As a kid, I used to follow these with like rapt anticipation, going to the midnight releases when those were still a thing, and being the first to get the book in the mail and read it as fast as I could the next day, kind of a thing. And I just don't do that anymore. And I think partially it's because I realized there are so many books in the world that I want to read already as it is, that I'm taking the pressure off of myself by not continuously adding thousands of books to my TBR list every year. I figure when they come in my path, I will enjoy them. But for the sake of this video, we will say the 4th Secret Project book by Brandon Sanderson. I was doing the no spoilers route, so I don't even know the title, don't know what it's about, don't know who the narrator is, nothing. But it's coming out this year, it is anticipated, and I think that counts. The book that was out of my comfort zone was 100% Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Shiguro. And if you've read this book, you'll understand why it's out of my comfort zone. It is more akin to a dystopian world built off of the My Sister's Keeper concept, rather than the fantasy world nonfiction based in real life kind of a book that I usually read. It was for my book club though, and I will say we had no shortage of things to talk about that night. So as far as a conversation starter, definitely did its job, and I'm glad that I read it, even if I'm not keeping the book or ever reading it again. And speaking of books that I will never be reading again, let's add The Trial by Kafka to that list. It was definitely my biggest disappointment of the year. It wasn't the worst book that I read this year. In fact, there was a lot of parts that I thought were intriguing or well written, but it was disappointing because I had really high hopes for it. I've read Metamorphosis by him and absolutely loved it. So I came into this thinking that I was going to find a new love and fall absolutely head over heels for it, and I really just didn't. This story just felt more wandering and less pointed than some of his other stories. As time passes, I keep connecting different parts of his story to various historical events, but these historical events all happened after he died, which means they clearly weren't intentionally related, but still somehow work together. Well, this book just left me with weird feelings all around and just a general what the poop kind of a vibe, which is a disappointment because it's not what I was expecting. My big surprise was Gallant by Victoria Schwab. I don't read horror, thriller, ghost vibes. That's just not really my cup of tea. But I was pleasantly surprised. Really, this book is ideal for middle schoolers, and it has elements of a horror or suspense type of novel, but it's more of a mysterious, edge of your seat, wonder what happens next kind of story rather than a terrifying jump scare kind of a book, which I think is perfect considering its intended audience. I was a middle school English teacher. This would have jumped to the top of my list for read alouds in class. Absolutely brilliant in terms of plot structure, writing technique, symbolism, character building, just mwah, beautifully done. My favorite new author was discovered because of the 52 book challenge that I'm doing this year, and it is Octavia Butler. I read her short story collection, Unexpected Stories, earlier this year, and I was blown away by the ingenuity of the worlds. These were 2 stories that were published after her death, and so I've heard that finding a hard copy is really difficult and they're kind of rare and more expensive, but I was able to do the audiobook through Libby, which was not too bad of a wait, and absolutely a joy to listen to. I haven't read more of her yet, just because some of her books are a little bit more divisive among reading groups, and I've heard that every single one of her stories is just so wildly different that it's harder for me to know what I'm getting into. But one of these days, I'm going to dive in headfirst and just immerse myself in her writing. Now, the past 2 years, I've kind of copped out on the fictional crush because I don't really fall for the bad guys or risky guys in the story. They do not appeal to me. They're idiots, they're stupid, like why would you ever think that that's appealing? This year, however, I read Graceling by Kristin Cashore, and let me tell you, Prince Po is a breath of fresh air. He is just a genuinely good guy, written in a way that doesn't make him boring or the lesser choice, which is just groundbreaking when you think about it. He is supportive, he doesn't belittle her, he honors her abilities, her power, her strength as a woman. He's constantly looking after her, thinking about her, putting her needs first, prioritizing her emotional comfort and mental space. And yes, of course, he has flaws and issues, but like a good, healthy relationship in a fantasy world was just so refreshing and lovely, and yes, I would take a Prince Po. My newest favorite character, she isn't really new, but I felt like her character took on a new aspect this year, and that is Tress from the Wax and Wane cycle by Brandon Sanderson. I have loved watching her character develop over the series, just the self-doubt that was crippling her from interacting with the world and the social anxiety, and I feel like in this book she really started to hit her stride as she started to understand a little bit more about the world and how she could fit into it. I feel like anyone who deals with anxiety will fall absolutely in love with her character, even if we don't identify as neurodivergent. The book that made me cry is a nonfiction book. It is 40 Autumns by Nina Willner. I don't know if crying is technically the right term, but it's definitely the book that made me feel the most and have the most despair and just outright emotional reaction to it. The amount of suffering and conflict that went on behind the Iron Curtain is just really hard to contemplate as someone who had never heard anything about it. And on the other hand, the book that made me happiest, this is where I ended up landing, Tress of the Emerald Sea. It was really hard to pick a category for this one because I didn't want to use it for everything. This is my new favorite character, my newest crush, my favorite release, my new favorite author, my happiest book, the best book. It could fit so many of these categories, and yet I am perfectly happy with it right here as the one that made me happiest. It was just a pure spark of joy to read. I honestly just smiled and laughed my way through the book, and sometimes you just need a good, well-written, light-hearted, jovial book to just carry you through a day. My favorite book-to-movie adaptation was a little tricky because I haven't watched a lot of adaptations this year, but I have done some TV shows, and I think my favorite would have to be A Small Light that National Geographic's put out on Disney Plus this year. By pure coincidence, my book club was reading The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank at the same time this was released. So it was really cool to be able to read and watch both of these things happening at the same time. Now, it really isn't an adaptation of Diary of a Young Girl, but they follow the same people, the same settings, the same conflicts and scenarios, so I felt like I had such a bigger understanding of what was happening at the time. We all know that when we read a diary, you're getting a very one-sided opinion of things, especially when the diary is from a young teenage girl. So I felt like A Small Light helped me to contextualize a lot of what Anne was going through and what she vaguely referred to as politics or Nazi activity in the book. She really doesn't go into a lot of the details around that. It's really much more of a personal reaction to how she's doing, how she's coping. And so A Small Light helped me to see the big world events and how people were dealing and managing this crisis. The larger scope of events and how they intertwined in all of the different lives was really incredible to learn about. The most beautiful book that I've bought or received this year is 1001 Nights, and it is a beautiful Penguin Classics edition. They label it as hardcover, but it is so much more. It doesn't just have the hardcover with a jacket. No. This is a hardcover with like a cloth bound and paint stenciled exterior. And when you pick it up, you just feel like you're discovering something precious and that you're about to read something beautiful. So far, the stories that I've read are interesting, but it's a little convoluted to keep track of like who's telling the story and how the moral of that story relates not only to the parent tale, but also to the larger overall theme of Scheherazade trying not to die. But I think my brain is enjoying that challenge, so I'm gonna keep reading it. As for the books that I need to read by the end of the year, it is less of a list of titles and more of a list of prompts and challenges. If you've been following this year, you'll know that I am doing the 52 book challenge, where there's a list of 52 prompts that you're trying to complete by reading one book every week of the year. I've read 34 out of the 52 books, and while each of the books that I've read fits one or more of the prompts, I haven't really puzzled them all into their spots yet. And I'm getting to the point where I actually really need to do that in order to know which book to pick up next. I think I'm going to be making that my next booktube video, where I really parse down all of the different prompts and mastermind where each book fits perfectly so that I can better plan my next few months of reading. As always, please leave any and all book recommendations below. I'm always on the hunt for a new author to follow. And if you enjoy this bookish content or my listed challenge approach to the year, don't forget to subscribe, as I am currently putting out travel prompt lists for European cities. I'll see you then.